The Reappearance of Parables by Bernard Brandon Scott. How should I go about putting together a profile of Jesus? I could construct a life of Jesus. There is much to speak for such a suggestion, because a story of Jesus' life would make it easier to make sense of it, to see how it fits together. However, one of the assured results of 150 years of the quest for the historical Jesus is that we do not have enough evidence to know how to construct such an outline. The only outline we have is the one created by the author of the Gospel according to Mark. I have chosen a different path. I have taken the material, both sayings and deeds, that has the highest claim to be from Jesus, based on the voting of the Jesus Seminar, and have asked, how does this material cohere? How does it fit together? Does it represent a consistent picture? After developing 3 theses which I think represent this coherent view of Jesus' sayings and deeds, I then will ask, what does this tell us about Jesus? Disappearance of parables. There is general consensus among scholars that the quest of the historical Jesus has entered a new stage since the mid-1980s. A characteristic of recent books, a trend that cuts across all of them, is the disappearance of parables. At one level, this is understandable because recent scholars have sought to shift the quest from Jesus' sayings to his deeds, since the previous generation of scholars had stressed the sayings and teachings of Jesus. This shift makes the disappearance of parables inevitable. The motives of individual authors vary. E.P. Sanders, in his Jesus and Judaism, distrusts language because it needs interpretation, and there is no way to secure that interpretation. So he turned his attention to a deed, Jesus' act in the temple, that provided the sure foundation, or so he thought. John P. Meyer dismisses parable interpretation in his A Marginal Jew because he neither approves of the methodology nor the current direction of parable studies. He attempts to figure out what the parables mean by predefining what the kingdom of God means. The kingdom of God determines the meaning of the parable, rather than the parable defining the kingdom of God. Because of this procedure, one can, for all practical purposes, dismiss the parables. Dale Allison takes a similar tack in his defense of millenarian understanding of Jesus. For both Meyer and Allison, it would appear that Jesus made a mistake in employing parables, since they are too pliable to make his point clearly. John Dominic Crossan, who had established his early reputation as a parable scholar, makes minimal use of parables in his The Historical Jesus. Since he selects material only from the earliest stages of the Jesus tradition that are multiply attested by independent witnesses, few parables get through his sieve. Marcus Borg, in his Meeting Jesus for the First Time, employs the insights from the parable studies of Robert Funk and Crossan in seeing the world turned upside down, but parables themselves are peripheral to his understanding of Jesus as a charismatic figure. At the other end of the spectrum, N.T. Wright makes use of parables, but he reverts to a pre-Eulicher position and accepts allegory as the way to read the parables. In the parable of the wicked tenants, Israel is the vineyard, her rulers the vineyard keepers, the prophets are the messengers, Jesus is the son. Israel's God, the creator, is himself the owner and father. Needless to say, such a march backwards is hardly the way forward. Parables once again. I have chosen to base my profile on the parables for 2 reasons. 1. Proverbs, aphoristic sayings, and parables dominate the database of Jesus' sayings, and 2. The parables of Jesus are a distinctive literary form within that group of sayings. Despite various assertions to the contrary, there is no evidence of parable teachers contemporary with Jesus. The rabbinic parable develops after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE and follows a very different stereotyped use. Even more, many forms in the Jesus database that are not parables often have a parabolic twist. For example, the other cheek, or coat and shirt, turn out to be burlesques of codified law, rather than the exact codification of case law. If when someone asked for my shirt, I also gave them my coat, I would soon be naked. That is, these sayings, along with the parables, exhibit what I and others have called the distinctive voice of Jesus. To use the parables as the base of my analysis, I have borrowed a model from surveying. To lay out a map, a surveyor establishes points and then coordinates those points. I have developed 3 different coordinates. Each coordinate is specified by a parable that provides the initial insight that allows me to sketch the general contour of that coordinate. I will expand the insight by relating various other sayings and deeds to form a coherent field for each coordinate. With each coordinate, we are, in a sense, plotting an aspect of Jesus' map. By triangulating the 3 points, the whole map of what Jesus is about should come into view. How these 3 fit together gives us the whole field. I have not engaged in a detailed analysis of each saying in this profile, but rely upon the work done in my Hear Then the Parable. Coordinate 1, the leaven. In the voting of the Jesus Seminar, the parable of the leaven attracted the highest ranking of any parable. I take that to be significant for 2 reasons. The parable has not figured strongly in anybody's reconstruction of the historical Jesus and receives little attention in the history of scholarship. Also, it indicates that the radical interpretation of this parable initiated by Robert Funk in Jesus as Precursor has won the day. Here, if anywhere, the distinctive voice of Jesus can be heard. Insight, God becomes unclean. The parable serves as a vehicle for the kingdom of God. How to translate the phrase basilei tau theou has provoked much discussion. Some prefer the ruling activity of God, while others have suggested God's imperial rule. The problem with kingdom is that the word in English is too vague, too ethereal. The more exact term is empire, because empires were the dominant political reality of the ancient world. So I prefer to translate this phrase, the empire of God. Empire suggests a stronger, more imperial tone, and has the virtue of implying its opposite. The opposite of the empire of God is the Roman Empire. If the term has negative overtones in English, that is all right, because empires had bad reputations in the ancient world as well. The parable of the leaven arranges a series of words into a pattern that the hearer must decode. We can view the parable at 2 different levels. At the level of a sentence, it appears to picture an everyday scene in which a woman mixes some leaven in dough to make bread. But even at the sentence level, oddities appear. The woman hides the leaven. She does not mix the leaven as one might expect. Likewise, the Greek word used here is not the neutral Greek word for hiding, but a word with strong negative overtones. She conceals the leaven in the dough. Even more, the amount of dough is extraordinary. 3 measures is about 50 pounds of flour, not the normal amount for a baking session. It produces a humorous image of the woman baking such a large amount, surely for a party. So while at the level of a simple sentence the parable appears to be everyday, closer examination suggests that things are not quite normal. The second level at which to understand the parable is as a metaphor or comparison for the empire of God. At this level it produces a cacophony. Leaven is a symbol for moral evil, the unclean. Unleaven is the proper symbol for the divine. According to Exodus, at Passover, for 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. 12:19. Twice Paul quotes the aphorism, a little leaven leavens the whole lump, to warn that a little evil will corrupt everything. Galatians 5:9, 1 Corinthians 5:7. It parallels the American aphorism, one rotten apple spoils the whole barrel. And Jesus warns his disciples to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, Mark 8:15. It is not too extreme to say that the juxtaposition of empire of God and leaven is blasphemous. The comparison of the empire of Rome to leaven would strike a Jewish audience as more appropriate. Besides this initial negative symbol, the parable piles on other problematic symbols. A woman hides or conceals the leaven until all is leavened. Until all is leavened brings the process of corruption to completion. The only symbolically positive term in the parable is 3 measures, which is probably a reference to the Messianic banquet. When Abraham receives the 3 angelic messengers at the oaks of Mamre, Sarah makes 3 cakes from 3 measures of flour, Genesis 18:6. The reference in the parable to 3 measures is where the parable at the sentence level bursts out of the everyday, because the amount is way beyond ordinary. It points to the extraordinary, something like the prophecy of Isaac's birth, a divine banquet. This one-sentence parable redefines the divine in parable. The divine is identified with the unclean, the impure. The involvement of the divine with the unclean does not result in the unclean becoming clean. The parable does not end with, until it was all unleavened. Thus, the divine becomes unclean, or, to restate this insight even more provocatively, God becomes unclean. On this fundamental insight, I will build a profile of Jesus. Convergence, snakes and doves. If this is literally what the parable means, then it is nonsensical. God, by definition, cannot be unclean. For this reason, the tradition has resisted the normal meaning of leaven, and instead has sought to understand the parable in a non-threatening, actually reassuring way. From a little beginning comes a great end. But the logic of parable is different from the logic of abstract discourse. To state in abstract discourse that God is unclean makes no sense at all, because the essence of God is to be clean. In abstract discourse, it would make more sense to say that God's rule has nothing to do with ethnic notions of purity. But in parabolic discourse, it makes sense. In metaphor, the daring connection of God and unclean, of empire of God and leaven, produces a new insight, a new disclosure. The disjunction between the two terms that produces meaning is what Wheelwright has called a diaphoric metaphor. By holding the unholdable together, meaning is produced. The parable has to be heard as a poem, not as an abstract, logical proposition about God. Thus, to say that God is unclean is my way of trying to express in abstract discourse the diaphoric quality of the oral, poetic metaphor of Jesus' parable. So radical is the proposition that God is unclean, so counterintuitive to normal religious thinking, indeed so offensive, that in order to demonstrate its correctness, I must show how it makes sense of items in the Jesus tradition, how it can serve as a unifying insight into how Jesus reimagined the world. In this section, I want to show how this initial insight converges with other items from the database. This allows further expansion of the insight, as well as producing what I hope is a convincing pattern within the database. This pattern or arrangement should begin to make the isolated sayings and deeds form a field on the map of Jesus' vision. The insight that God becomes unclean goes a long way toward explaining the frequent references to Jesus' association with the outcast, lepers, and sinners, and the special place of women in his activity. These people find themselves accepted as they are without the need to become clean or honorable. The congratulations also belong to this coordinate, for they congratulate people who are not obviously to be congratulated. The poor are congratulated because they are poor, and to them belongs the empire of God, not because they will be rich. This overturns the assumption that poverty and disease are God's punishment for sins that underlies the books of the Hebrew Bible from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings. What goes in is an explicit applying of this insight to food laws. The argument that it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out, upsets the ability of the food laws to define what is clean and holy. Jesus appears to have carried out this aphorism literally in his eating habits by not washing his hands and eating with unclean people. The function of food laws is to codify the divine so one can know where the divine is. But if foods can no longer represent and replicate the divine by marking the line between clean and unclean, then people can no longer be divided into clean and unclean. This same rejection of the line between the clean and unclean finds expression in several parables. In the mustard seed, the planting of mustard seed, a weed-like plant, pollutes the garden, makes it unclean. Various revisions of the parable have obscured this aspect, though it is clearly in the Q, Lucan version. Likewise, Crossan has shown in his analysis of the treasure that the treasure, a gift, becomes a seduction for the man who, in his joy at finding the treasure, rushes out to do an immoral thing. He buries the treasure and goes and buys the field, thus signaling that the treasure is not his. He steals it from its rightful owner. This parable is a counterpoint to the leaven. What is good, a treasure, seduces the man into doing evil. Belonging to this same coordinate is the eye of a needle. The rich man is like treasure, one who, according to Deuteronomy, should be congratulated. But it will be more difficult for him to enter the empire of God than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Likewise, the warning against the privileges of scholars, who like to parade around in long robes, belongs here. Scholars know what is clean and unclean, and who can thus represent the divine. But they should not be imitated, for the basis on which their scholarship rests has been undermined. The complex of sayings dealing with the able-bodied and sick clearly indicates that God is on the side of the sick. It is they who need a physician. God identifies not with the honorable and righteous, but the shamed and sinners. Finally, into this coordinate I would place those parables that exhibit characters who do not quite seem to conform to the standard of behavior thought appropriate to the empire of God. For example, the violence of the assassin who tests his power by thrusting his sword through a wall shocks the hearer. Like the dishonesty of the man who finds treasure, the wheeling and dealing of the shrewd manager has confounded various interpreters since before the parable was incorporated into the gospel tradition. When dismissed from his job as steward, he goes to those who owe debts to his master and drastically reduces their debts. The master of the parable is no more honorable, for he has been profiting from interest charged by the manager. The shamelessness of the man who delays in welcoming his guest in Two Friends at Midnight, and the corrupt judge who fears neither God nor people in dealing with the widow's request, both exhibit behavior that confounds an audience. The very amorality of the parables has proven so problematic for most interpreters that the tradition has tried to explain it away. In the end, it is the toll collector standing at the back of the temple begging for mercy who goes home acquitted, and not the Pharisee who openly gives God thanks. The temple no longer sets the rules, and the toll collector is unrepentant. He is still a toll collector. No prophet is welcome on his home turf because there the rules are known. So one is homeless. Unlike the foxes who have dens, the son of Adam has no place to lay his head. Jesus' probable conflict with his family and village belongs to this coordinate. What is one to do in a situation where leaven represents the empire of God, when what goes into a person does not defile, where toll collectors go home acquitted, the poor are congratulated, and home has disappeared? You must be as sly as a snake and as simple as a dove. Coordinate 2, the empty jar. In contrast with the leaven, the parable of the empty jar barely made the list of authentic sayings of Jesus compiled by the Jesus Seminar. There are a number of reasons for this. The parable occurs only in Thomas, and there is little history of scholarship concerning this parable. While these two reasons alone make me hesitant to build a significant aspect of my profile on this parable, I still think it unambiguously makes an important point. Insight: God is present in absence. At the most elementary discourse level, the parable is about loss. The woman starts out with a jar full of grain, but arrives home empty-handed. The handle of the jar broke. She didn't know it. She put the jar down and discovered that it was empty. The empire is identified with loss, with accident, with emptiness. It is also possible that the story of Elijah's miracle for the widow of Zarephath, as told in 1 Kings 17:8-16, lies in the background, furnishing a contrast story to the parable. During a famine, a widow feeds Elijah. When he first approaches her, she says, "I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jar." Elijah commands her to bake, but to bring him the first cake. "For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal shall not be spent until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." She does as Elijah commands, and the prophet, she, and her child have meal throughout the famine. The parable of the empty jar presents a contrast to the story of the widow with a full jar. There is no prophet to come to her aid, no end-time miracle to set things aright. Even if I am not correct about the Elijah counter-reference, the basic narrative is clear. There is no divine intervention. She goes home empty-handed. This leads me to my second foundational insight. The empire of God is identified not with divine intervention, but divine emptiness. Recasting the insight will help to bring it into focus. God is not found in the apocalyptic miracle. One must look elsewhere. This parable fills out aspects of the profile intimated in the leaven. Like the leaven, it identifies the empire of God with the marginalized, the female, the unclean. And in the end, all is leavened. The jar is empty. Convergence, spread out but not seen. The saying that most obviously belongs to this coordinate is the coming of God's imperial rule. This saying explicitly rejects the ability of people to point to or observe the empire of God. On the contrary, God's imperial rule is right there in your presence. Both the Thomas and Lucan versions of the saying agree on these two basic points. You cannot point to it, yet it is here. This presence of the empire of God, not observable in your presence, spread out upon the earth but not seen, indicates the paradox that the empire of God is present in absence. There is divine action in the empire of God, but it cannot be observed. The first congratulations help us understand this coordinate of sayings. The saying says, "Congratulations, you poor, God's domain belongs to you." They are in the empire of God and are still poor. It does not say, "Blessed are you poor, for you shall be middle class." The activity of God will not be manifest in a change from poor to rich. Rather, it is manifest in the paradox that to the poor belongs the empire of God. To say that God is present in absence is the same as saying that to the poor belongs the empire of God. In the mustard seed, the plant does not become the great cedar of Lebanon, the more appropriate metaphor for an empire. The mustard plant is more like a weed. In the seed and harvest, the harvest belongs to a farmer who does not quite know what is going on. He does not observe the activity of God because he is asleep. But the last line of the parable quotes a passage in Joel about the end time, apocalyptic war. "Prepare war. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning forks into spears. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe." Joel 3, 9-13. When the farmer puts in his sickle, the occasion is not the ultimate end-time war between nations, but simply the actions of farmer who is bringing the harvest in. Even though the parable of the sower moves towards the expectation of a dramatic harvest as a climax to its stages of failure, the harvest is quite ordinary. It is not a harvest in which one grape makes 5 and 20 measures of wine, as in the rabbinic speculations on the great harvest. If images of apocalyptic expectation are rejected, the observer will need to be very sharp-eyed. Instead of watching over the 99, the shepherd may abandon the whole flock for the one that wandered away, lost sheep. Not a very good bargain. And the judge who does not fear God may be the one to vindicate the widow, corrupt judge. To push even more, it may be dangerous to ask for God's intervention. In the parable of the unforgiving slave, after the king forgives the slave a huge astronomical debt, his fellow slaves observe his lack of forgiveness of another slave, who by comparison owes a very small amount. These fellow slaves go and tell the king about the slave's lack of forgiveness, at which point the king takes back his forgiveness of the debt and turns the man over to the torturers. This king is a real Hellenistic tyrant. The fellow slaves, by turning in the first slave, have done the same thing to him that he had done to the slave who owed him a debt. And these fellow slaves turned him over in the name of a greater justice. The king tyrant has made the situation even worse. Now they are dealing with a real autocrat. They have no criteria for his behavior. He may forgive everything or take it all back. This is hardly a model for God's empire. What is one to do in such a situation? One has to be very observant and see what is actually there. Grapes are not harvested from thorn trees, nor are figs gathered from thistles. From the complex on anxieties, don't fret. The whole complex of sayings that deal with anxiety fits in here. One should not worry about clothes or eating or anything else. The parable of the rich farmer tells the other side of this story. Having a bounteous harvest, he tears down his barns and builds new ones. Yet that night he dies. His anxiety did him no good. Furthermore, even though God intervened, no one will ever know it. Both the parables of the empty jar and the rich farmer move from bounty, full jar, great harvest, to loss, empty jar, death. Several recent studies of Jesus have put the healing and exorcisms of Jesus at the heart of their reconstruction. Even though it is difficult to trace individual stories of healing and exorcism back to the earliest levels of the Jesus tradition, there can be no doubt that Jesus was a healer and exorcist. How does that activity of Jesus fit into this coordinate that I am developing? Does it not seem to contradict it? The most explicit saying in which Jesus refers to his exorcisms equates what he does with the finger of God. If by God's finger I drive out demons, then for you God's imperial rule has arrived. The phrase finger of God is used in the story of Moses' contest with the magicians of Pharaoh's court. When Aaron strikes the dust, a great swarm of gnats appears. The magicians, unable to duplicate the feat, tell Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Exodus 8:15. The use of that phrase means that Jesus' exorcisms bear the same relationship to Moses' wonder-working as the mustard plant does to the great cedar Lebanon. Both make ironical claims that burlesque expectations. In a similar vein, the saying about Satan's house being divided against itself indicates that there were those who saw Jesus' activity as that of Satan himself. Thus, the activity of God in Jesus' own exorcisms is not obviously God's activity. Perhaps this is the context in which one should view Jesus' claim to have seen Satan falling from heaven like lightning. Jesus views his healings and exorcisms as divine activities, but they are not the miraculous deeds of Moses, nor does his wonder-working fill up the empty jar. It still demands insight on the part of the audience. He begins by saying, "if by the finger of God," indicating that the viewer must judge what kind of activity this is, and some will judge it to be the activity of Satan. Coordinate 3. From Jerusalem to Jericho. The Samaritan, or as I prefer to call it, from Jerusalem to Jericho, received a very high vote of confidence from the Jesus Seminar, even though only a single version has survived in the Gospel of Luke. This parable is one of the most popular in the tradition and one of the most frequent topics in religious art. Insight: cooperation, not competition. To understand this narrative parable, we must take up the point of view of a Jewish audience, and thus firmly set aside the Gentile perspective in which the Samaritan is a good fellow, as Luke and the tradition have insisted. From the perspective of a first-century Palestinian audience, the Samaritan is the expected opponent or villain, the moral equivalent of leaven, and assigning the hero's role to him, instead of the priest or Levite or even the expected Israelite, is the same as finding the jar empty. Even more, this parable envisions interpersonal relations on a basis other than those of an agonistic contest. In a Mediterranean culture, relations of all types were agonistic, viewed as contest, because all goods are viewed as limited and fixed, and so one must always be in a contest, an agon, to get a share of the limited supply. To accept this parable as anything but a fantasy, a hearer must accept the Samaritan as helper-hero instead of expected opponent-villain, and oneself as victim in the ditch. An audience is not even offered the opportunity of an agonistic contest in the narrative. The man in the ditch is passive, and the Samaritan simply has compassion, effectively ending the story in mid-narrative. The Samaritan cannot even be the man's patron because their social spaces are so different. This leads to my third fundamental insight. A parable reimagines human relationships apart from the agonistic contest. Cooperation, not competition, is the basis for human social structure in the empire of God. Convergence, the great leveling. Jesus' meals are probably the immediate context in which this coordinate found its most concrete expression. Eating together, sharing food in a society constantly threatened by hunger and famine, concretely demonstrated what cooperation meant. This is the context in which I would seek to understand the second and third congratulations, dealing with hunger and weeping. The archetype is congratulations, you poor. In that beatitude, there is no future in which the poor become rich. That beatitude should guide our understanding of the other two. You will have a feast and you will laugh do not refer to the apocalyptic future, but to the practice of cooperation within the meal events. There, all will share what they have. So profound is this cooperation, so deep does it reach into the established structures of first-century reality, that the Samaritan can be envisioned as the hero-helper, and one can be commanded to love your enemies. The other side of this occurs in the rich farmer. He exposes himself as an Epicurean. Then I'll say to myself, you have plenty put away for years to come. Take it easy, eat, drink, enjoy yourself. He co-opts a fantastic harvest for himself, but that night he dies. And so his harvest, like Joseph's in Egypt, will be available for the village. God does intervene in this parable, but to the villagers who helped the rich man build new barns, his death will be a natural one, and they will mourn for this generous man who has provided for them. They will not see the hand of God in his death, though without his death they would have starved. He intended to keep the whole harvest for himself. The saying about children in God's domain indicates who people the empire of God. Children are an appropriate image because they cannot play the adult roles that are being rejected as inappropriate for life in the empire. The recasting of the family is fundamental to this redefinition of community. True relatives are no longer one's natural family, but those who do what my father wants are my brothers and my mother. The other side of this redefinition of family is the very hating of one's family. There is even the abandonment of a fundamental familial duty to bury the dead. Leave it to the dead to bury their own dead. This re-envisioned family contains a reimagining of God as Father. The seminar voted overwhelmingly that Jesus used Abba to refer to God as Father. Regardless of how Abba is to be understood, clearly the tenor of Father as a metaphor for God is very different than our Father in heaven. The latter is part of the patriarchal patron-client world. The former is an effort to redefine family. The parable of the prodigal son exhibits in great detail a narrative of this reimagined family. The father in the parable at times plays a foolish and shameless role, and at other times a female role. From the very beginning of the narrative, he exhibits little in the way of male honor. The admonition of Sirach about the distribution of inheritance is clear. While you are still alive and have breath in you, do not let anyone take your place. It is better that your children should ask from you than that you should look to the hands of your sons. At the time when you end the days of your life, in the hour of death, distribute your inheritance. Sirach 33:21-23. The father of this parable surrenders his property, a foolish act, putting himself and his family at risk. He runs and kisses his younger son instead of maintaining his male dignity. He addresses the elder son as baby. This shameful aspect of the father has been thoroughly hidden in the history of scholarship. Moreover, the father does not choose between his sons. He accepts both regardless of what they do. The acceptance of one is not purchased by means of the rejection of the other, as is typical in such stories of elder and younger sons in the Hebrew Bible and other cultures. Finally, there is a third act implied but unspoken in the narrative. The story ends with a younger son feasting on the fatted calf with all the signs of acceptance: shoes on his feet, a signet ring on his finger, and the father's best robe as his garment, thinking he has struck a clever bargain with the father. Meanwhile, outside waits an angry elder son who still has all the property. What happens when the father dies? If the sons continue on their same trajectories, the younger pushing the boundaries, the elder feeling himself the abused family slave, they will kill each other. or they can emulate the Father. He is all forgiveness. There is nothing the sons can do that he will not forgive, regardless of the cost to him. He is willing to surrender all his male honor to preserve his sons in family. Or, as another saying has it, whoever tries to hang on to life will forfeit it, but whoever forfeits it will preserve it. While exactly what is at stake in the leased vineyard is not very clear, it surely represents an agonistic contest run amok. The owner, who relies on the respect due him as a patron and social superior, misjudges the intent of those who have leased his vineyard. These also calculate that they can get away with their acts of violence. The parable exhibits how bankrupt is a world based on agonistic contest. It is a world of unending violence. In the vineyard laborers, those hired first complain that by paying the last hired the same amount they have received, the master has made them equal. The laborer's complaint is that the master has destroyed the order of the world. The entire Roman Empire was organized as patron-client system. The ultimate patron was the emperor, and the system worked its way downward, with his clients in turn becoming patrons for yet other clients, and their fleas have fleas too. Such a system ensures a hierarchically arranged social order in which no one is equal, and every social engagement is a contest to determine one's place in the hierarchy. The empire of God brings everyone to the same level. This parable is retold from the rich man's point of view in the dinner party. In order to throw his party, he must invite the homeless and forfeit the company of those rich like himself. So radical is this break between these two ways of organizing social relations that one cannot have two masters, something demanded by the patron-client organization of society. Calculating which master to please is a hazard of everyday life. The organization of the emperor's world is diametrically opposed to that of God's. Give to the emperor what belongs to the emperor. Give God what belongs to God. This re-imaging of social relations finds one of its clearest expressions in those sayings burlesquing case law: other cheek, coat and shirt, second mile, give to beggars, lend without return. Case law attempts to work out in advance and in detail all the situations or cases implied by a law. These sayings of Jesus burlesque case law through a similar form and strategy. If someone asks for your shirt, give them also your coat. In such a case, one would soon be naked. If you turn the other cheek, you would soon be black and blue, beaten about the face. And finally, if you gave every time someone begged, you soon would be broke. These examples of case law all subvert the very effort of case law to specify what is moral. When you give charity, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Outcomes. The world implied in these three coordinates reimagines a community's social experience. The empire of God as leaven does not warrant a license to do whatever one wants. Rather, the unclean are accepted as welcomed by God, as they are, without the necessity of becoming clean. Likewise, when the empire of God is an empty jar, then the community must accept responsibility for its life and not fall back on the narcotic of divine intervention to set things right. When the Samaritan is the hero helper, then social cooperation is defined outside the bounds of the traditional agonistic relations of a patron-client relationship. These three aspects go a long way towards redefining basic human relationships as conceived within a Mediterranean peasant culture. The empire of God is at the core of Jesus' reimagining. It is the presiding symbol, whether or not it is always or ever the referent of the parables. Also, the understanding of the empire of God must be derived from Jesus' language activity, rather than from an historical survey of Jewish literature. Such a survey produces little fruit because of the very infrequent appearance of the phrase. As a symbol, Empire of God stands for the experience that results from the language activity of Jesus. The coming of God's imperial rule clearly indicates that it is a non-empirical reality. You won't be able to observe the coming of God's imperial rule. People are not going to be able to say, "Look, here it is," or "over there." Jesus surely uses empire in an ironical sense, since the empire of God fails to measure up when compared to the empires of David or Caesar. This irony and non-comparison is clearly represented in the emperor and God. Give the emperor what belongs to the emperor, give God what belongs to God. To define it negatively, the empire of God is not like the empire of David or Caesar. As a symbol, the empire of God is like the American flag. It stands for a whole series of complex values that cannot be expressed clearly. That is why one needs to employ a symbol to represent it. But to go even further, I think the empire of God functions to create through imagination a sphere in which those who are part of this community of envisioning can experience healing, the hospitality of the unclean, the presence of God in God's non-empirical activity. Death of Jesus. The reasons for the death of Jesus probably remain beyond our grasp. Empires can and do act in authoritarian ways that escape the cool rationality of law or reason. Pilate did not really need a solid case to kill Jesus, yet one can see in Jesus' language activity the seeds of a conflict that could easily escalate to a confrontation and to death. And the parable of the leaven and what it implies are sufficient blasphemy to put Jesus into conflict with the religious authorities. For them, the symbol of God's activity is the unleavened, the clean. The leavened bread must be swept out to make a place pure and holy, set apart. And even though Jesus explicitly separates God's empire and Caesar's, the success of Jesus' social experiment in peasant community under the symbol of the empire of God would pose a threat to Rome's rule. Rome's rule is built on the premise that the local population is divided and distrustful of each other. A peasantry that accepts each other, that no longer sees itself in agonistic conflict with each other, always defending their given and limited positions, even reaching out to Samaritan enemies, poses a real threat to Rome's rule by thwarting its attempts to divide and conquer. Jesus as rebel, a social science model. One of the most perplexing problems in the quest for the historical Jesus is why Jesus opted for such a radical program. Frequently, this problem is avoided and one falls back on the inevitability of history. What happened had to happen. But of course that is not true. It is the fallacy of the inevitable. Like most peasants in his situation, Jesus could have sat back and done nothing. At other times, I suspect that an assumed Christology warrants the model. Unthinkingly, we fall back on faith commitments as though those explain why Jesus chose so revolutionary an agenda. What complicates any attempt to solve the problem is the very lack of data. We know almost nothing about Jesus' interior life, his psychological or social development, nor do we possess even a chronological narrative in which to arrange a life of Jesus. Social science methods have provided a way forward. Crossan, for example, presents in his The Historical Jesus, the Life of a Mediterranean Jewish Peasant, a model of brokerage in the Roman Empire that produced a system on the verge of breakdown. But what Crossan has explained is why the Roman Empire was such an unstable society and why the Jews revolted in 68 CE. What no social model can explain is why an individual decides to revolt. Social sciences deal with social groups, not individuals. Frank Sulloway in Born to Rebel, Birth Order, Family Dynamics, and Creative Lives has produced an impressive and controversial study seeking to explain why people rebel. While the reasons are complex, as his title indicates, the model with the most predictive power is birth order, combined with various aspects of family dynamics. For Sulloway, the most important aspect in the model is birth order. Later born are more likely to be rebels because of the internal evolutionary dynamics of family life. Children have to find a niche in the family structure in order to prove their value to their parents. Parents invest most heavily in the firstborn, and to be more precise, the firstborn male in traditional societies. Thus, the firstborn does not have to search for a niche and automatically receives a high investment from the parents. Firstborns more naturally identify strongly with power and authority. Later-borns must find their own niche in the family, so in order to succeed, they must be open to experience. Openness to experience is a term psychologists employ to indicate a crucial aspect of the creative process. People who exhibit openness are described as imaginative, flexible, creative, independent, and liberal. Birth order, gender, and temperament interact to produce personality characteristics. These are, in Soloway's argument, more determinative of the creative individual than social class. If social class were the dominant factor, we would expect siblings to be very similar. Yet, siblings raised together are almost as different in their personalities as people from different families. Thus, family structure produces the difference. In developing his thesis, Soloway argues from the centrality of birth order, but other factors in a family's dynamics make the model more predictive. By itself, the birth order will not correctly predict openness to experience any more accurately than flipping a coin. But when combined with other factors, for example, conflict with a parent, then the predictive power rises substantially. A major problem with employing Soloway's model to understand Jesus is that we know almost nothing about Jesus' birth order. Thus, we confront Samuel Sandmel's law. Minimal evidence leads to maximal theories. Still, I think the model can be helpful. It can be used negatively to call into question certain assumptions. Meyer envisions Jesus as the firstborn, raised in an intact family, with Joseph teaching his son Jesus his trade and schooling him in Hebrew and the traditions of Judaism. If this were in fact the case, then, according to Soloway's evidence, the chance that Jesus would lead a radical revolution would be less than 2%. So perhaps the traditional assumption about Jesus' birth order and family situation can be set aside. At the risk of sliding down the slippery road of speculation not built on facts, there are aspects in the tradition that can be of use. The tradition of Jesus as the firstborn very probably results not from family remembrance, but from faith speculating about the significance of Jesus. James may well be the elder brother of Jesus, and what little we know of him would support this theory. His assumption of power and the maintenance of family authority in Jerusalem result from the adaptive strategies of a firstborn. Soloway notes that the death of a parent or a missing parent has a strong effect on siblings. The firstborn becomes more conservative, the later-born more open to experience, more likely to rebel. The existence of Joseph has long been problematic, since he appears only in the later stages of the tradition, having no mention in Mark or Q, and having no role in the sayings of Jesus. This absence of Joseph during the life of Jesus led later Christians to speculate that he was an old man when he married Mary and had died by the time Jesus was active. Joseph is surely a later fiction of the gospel writers. So we have no good evidence for Jesus' father. Jane Schauberg has argued that the birth of Jesus was illegitimate. Whatever the facts about Jesus' father, his absence from the family would have had a strong impact on the siblings. Finally, the tradition contains evidence of conflict between Jesus and his own family. Clearly, they were not part of his original group of followers. These three factors, later-born birth rank, absence of a father, and conflict with the family, would, in Soloway's model, put Jesus in the group most inclined to support a radical response. Soloway's model is powerful, and I find it helpful. As the response of his book develops, we will get a clearer idea of both its problems and its strengths. But it offers a way to begin to sort out some issues and clarify what we can and cannot explain. The interface between the historical, social scientific, and family dynamics models is very important. The historical social model provides evidence about the specific cognitive and ideological structures that make up a culture. Family dynamics helps us understand how an individual responds to that structure, why some support the structure while others revolt. Paraboler as poet. Jesus' revolt takes a very special form. He revolts in parable. I see no evidence that Jesus was leading a political revolution or that he had a social program in mind. He clearly affected the lives of people, but he was not a social organizer or activist. Although the idea is now out of fashion, Jesus, the oral storyteller, seems to me closer to a poet. The activist will always be dissatisfied with the poetic vision, but change comes about because a creative individual has had that vision. At times it seems to me that it is easier to know what Jesus is against than what he is for. To borrow a term from computer science, Jesus' vision is against the default world, especially insofar as the default world is oppressive and destructive of the life of those he calls the poor. He is opposed to the purity code and the imperial order as models for God. He is not simply a contrarian, but often it is easier to make clear what one stands against than exactly what one stands for. Seamus Heaney has recently addressed this issue in his The Redress of Poetry. I take the liberty of quoting a passage that is to the point. And in the activity of poetry, too, there is a tendency to place a counter-reality in the scales, a reality which may be only imagined, but which nevertheless has weight, because it is imagined within the gravitational pull of the actual, and can therefore hold its own and balance out against the historical situation. This redressing effect of poetry comes from its being a glimpsed alternative, a revelation of potential that is denied or constantly threatened by circumstances. And sometimes, of course, it happens that such a revelation, once enshrined in the poem, remains as a standard for the poet, so that he or she must then submit to the strain of bearing witness in his or her own life to the place of consciousness established in the poem. In his explanation of how poetry functions, Heaney brings out a number of points that are critical to understanding how Jesus' parables and aphorisms operated. Jesus' vision is not an alternative to the default world in the sense that it is a replacement. It is a counterweight, a counter-reality in Heaney's terms. Thus, it is always dialogically related to that default world. The default world will almost always win in the long run because it is the default. That is why Jesus' own language betrayed him in the end. Jesus' parables are a glimpsed alternative, a revelation of potential that is denied or constantly threatened by circumstance, or in my terms, constantly threatened by the default world. A glimpsed alternative is not a worked-out program. It is always temporary, glimpsed. It is a possibility, not a reality. Once enshrined in parable, it remains a standard for the poet, or in this case, Jesus. Thus, it is not the empire of God that drives Jesus, but the glimpse enshrined in the parable that is likened to the empire of God. It is an alternative reality only as a counterbalance to the real reality, whether the Roman Empire or the temple state. As Heaney remarks, the poet must then submit to the strain of bearing witness in his or her own life to the place of consciousness established in the poem. In Jesus' parables, his consciousness is established, and his life bears witness to that consciousness. Thus, the parables provide the coordinates for understanding Jesus' deeds. A problem with this view of Jesus is that it runs counter to the assumption that he is the founder of a new religion. This demands something new and complete, not something in counterbalance, not just a glimpse. Such a view of Jesus appears too ephemeral for what came afterwards, Christianity and the Church triumphant. With my view, Jesus remains firmly attached to Judaism and is engaged in an argument within Judaism. He is a part of a continuing debate. To put it too boldly, he is against the Deuteronomist and sides with Job. Several scholars have strongly objected to a view of Jesus that puts his language and parables at the center. Sanders has objected that it is difficult to make his, Jesus's, teaching offensive enough to lead to execution. Meyer is even more acid in his remarks. A Tweedy poet who spent his time spinning out parables and Japanese koans, a literary aesthete who toyed with first-century deconstructionism, or a bland Jesus who simply told people to look at the lilies of the field, such a Jesus would threaten no one, just as the university professors who create him threaten no one. Perhaps Meyer's remark reflects his own impotency in a capitalist society rather than an objective assessment of the words in the ancient world. Socrates, next to Jesus, one of the most famous martyrs of the ancient world, died because of his provocative language, and the fate of Salman Rushdie in our own day demonstrates the power of words in a traditional society. Poets still have power. To return to Heaney's argument, poetry is a redress because it envisions a reality which may be only imagined, but which nevertheless has weight because it is imagined within the gravitational pull of the actual, and therefore can hold its own and balance out against the historical situation. The redress of the parable is hope, and hope has power, not because it is a concrete program, a worked-out plan or blueprint, but because it creates the counter-reality to the default moral world. It says, things do not have to be this way. Václav Havel was imprisoned for his poems and plays, led the Velvet Revolution, and became the first president of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. What Havel has to say about hope explains how parables and the empire of God functioned as a revolutionary symbol for Jesus and his followers. Hope, he says, is a state of mind, not a state of the world, and it's not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. It is no accident that those who espouse an apocalyptic Jesus avoid the parables. You cannot get from the parables to an apocalyptic Jesus, although you can get from an apocalyptic Jesus to an apocalyptic interpretation of the parables. But such an interpretation is the default moral world, because apocalyptic is the Deuteronomist vision as the future divine fact. From an apocalyptic Jesus, one does get to the founder of Christianity. In his understanding of the redress of poetry, Heaney has captured an insight into how Jesus' language offered to his audience an alternative to the world in which they were trapped, a world burdened by purity laws segregating the unclean from the clean and into further degrees of purity or shame, a world where those on the bottom are imprisoned in unchangeable structures and await a divine solution, a world in which enemies threaten at every point. Jesus, in his language, offers a counter-world, a vision, an openness to experience. It is a glimpsed alternative, a revelation of potential that is denied or constantly threatened by circumstances. It may be only an imagined or reimagined alternative, but it derives its weight from its opposition to and careful observation of the historical world. Apart from the gravitational pull of that historical world, it is without meaning, or open to whatever one wants it to mean. Jesus revolts in parable, and the parables create a counter-world, a hoped-for world that redresses the world as it is, and surely makes sense, regardless of how it turns out, even if it turns out to be his crucifixion.